The soft chime of the church bell echoed across the town as Claire pulled up to the old family house. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel, her knuckles whitening as she hesitated to get out. It had been nearly a decade since she'd been here, yet the sight of the crumbling brick facade, the chipped green shutters, and the overgrown hydrangeas brought a pang of nostalgia and unease. Her father's funeral had been yesterday, a small, quiet affair. Too quiet, Claire thought bitterly. Aside from a few neighbors and her father's accountant, no one else had come. He'd been a stern man, a recluse in his later years, but he had always been larger than life in her childhood memories. Now, all that remained of him was this house, and the secrets she knew it held. Claire stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath her feet sending shivers down her spine. The house smelled of dust and faint traces of her father's old tobacco pipe. Her heels clicked against the wood as she made her way to the study, the room her father had guarded most fiercely. The desk was exactly as she remembered it, large, oak, and intimidating, with brass handles that gleamed despite the years. But what caught her eye wasn't the desk. It was the small, locked box sitting neatly on top of it. She hadn't noticed it during the funeral preparations. Her heart raced as she reached out to touch it, the cold metal of the lock biting into her fingers. Taped to the lid was a folded note in her father's neat handwriting. For Claire. Only when the time is right. The time is right, she muttered under her breath, yanking the note off. She tried the desk drawers for a key, finding nothing but old receipts and empty pins. Frustrated, she rummaged through the study until she found a letter opener, its sharp edge gleaming like a tiny sword. With a determined breath, she wedged it into the lock and pried the box open. Inside were letters, dozens of them, their edges yellowed with age, bound together by a frayed ribbon. Each one was addressed to her, and at the bottom of every envelope was the same scrawled name, Ethan. Her chest tightened. Ethan, the brother who had vanished when they were 16, the brother no one had spoken of since. Hands trembling, Claire opened the first letter. Claire, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't even know if you'll remember me, or if you'll even care. But I have to believe you will. You were the only one who looked at me like I mattered. The only one who didn't pretend I was invisible. I never wanted to leave you. They made me go. Mom, Dad, they thought it was for the best. For the family. But it wasn't for me. I didn't even get to say goodbye. Ethan. Claire sank onto the edge of the desk, the letter slipping from her fingers. Her pulse thundered in her ears as a flood of memories surfaced. The laughter, the shared secrets, the day she woke up and Ethan was simply gone. For years, she had convinced herself he'd run away, that he hadn't cared enough to stay. But now, it seemed there was more to the story. Something her parents had hidden. Clutching the letter, Claire made a silent vow. She would find her brother. No matter how long it took, no matter what it uncovered, she had to know the truth. Claire couldn't sleep that night. The silence of the house, broken only by the occasional groan of old pipes, pressed in around her. She sat cross-legged on the floor of the study, surrounded by a sea of Ethan's letters. Each one felt like a piece of a puzzle, offering glimpses of his life after he left, and the pain he carried. She had only managed to read a handful before the words became too heavy to bear. They took me to a place called St. Margaret's, one letter read. A boarding school, they said. It wasn't a school, it was a prison. They said I was a bad influence on you, that I was troubled. I wasn't troubled, Claire. I was just me. Her throat tightened at those words. Ethan had always been different. While Claire had excelled at school, following their parents' rigid expectations without question, Ethan had been the dreamer, the artist. He'd paint vivid landscapes in his room late at night or spend hours tinkering with old radios in the garage. Their parents didn't understand him, and Claire had always known they disapproved. But to send him away? She reached for another letter. I tried to write you so many times, Claire, but they never let me send anything. They said it would only make things worse. You'll thank us when you're older, Dad said once. Do you thank them, Claire? Are you older now and thankful that I'm gone? I think about you every day. I wonder if you even remember my face. A sob escaped her lips, and she clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle it. How had their parents kept this from her? Why had they done this to him? Her phone buzzed beside her, pulling her back to the present. It was her best friend, Maya. You okay? Maya's voice was soft but concerned. I know it's been a rough couple of days. I don't know, Claire admitted, her voice thick with emotion. I found something, letters from Ethan. Do you remember him? Maya was quiet for a moment. Your brother? Of course, I remember. You used to talk about him all the time before he left. He didn't leave, Claire said, her jaw tightening. They sent him away. I just found out. Oh my God, Maya whispered. Claire, are you sure? I have his letters, Maya. He's been writing to me this whole time. And now, I have to find him. Do you even know where to start? Maya asked gently. Claire glanced down at the pile of envelopes. Most of them were undated, but the return addresses were all the same. A post office box in a small town 2 hours away. I have an idea, Claire said. There's an address. It's a long shot, but it's all I've got. The next morning, Claire stood in front of the post office in Ashwood, a sleepy town nestled in the foothills of the mountains. The air was crisp, and the streets were quiet, save for the occasional chatter of an early morning coffee drinker. The clerk behind the counter raised an eyebrow when Claire approached. I'm looking for someone who might have used this post office box, she said, sliding a copy of the address across the counter. It's for my brother. We've been out of touch for a long time, and I'm trying to find him. The clerk frowned. I'm sorry, miss. We don't give out information about box holders. Claire's heart sank. I understand, but please. I haven't seen him in nearly 20 years. This is my only lead. The clerk hesitated, glancing over his shoulder. Look, I can't tell you anything officially, but the guy who rented that box? He hasn't picked up mail in a while. Last I heard, he worked at the auto shop on Cedar Street. You might try there. The bell above the door jingled as Claire stepped into the shop. The smell of motor oil and rubber filled the air, and the sound of clanging tools echoed in the background. A man in his 40s looked up from under the hood of a car, wiping his hands on a rag. Can I help you? He asked, his tone wary. I'm looking for Ethan, Claire said, her voice steady despite the nervous knot in her stomach. Ethan Grant. The man's eyes flickered with recognition, but his expression darkened. What do you want with Ethan? I'm his sister, she said. I need to see him. For a moment, the man didn't respond. Then he sighed, tossing the rag onto a nearby workbench. Ethan doesn't work here anymore. He quit a few months back, but he's still around, as far as I know. He lives out by Ridgeview Creek, in the old cabin. Thank you, Claire said, her heart racing. Thank you so much. The drive to Ridgeview Creek felt like an eternity. When she finally pulled up to the cabin, her breath caught in her throat. It was small and weathered, surrounded by tall pines. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. As she stepped out of the car, the cabin door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the morning light. His hair was longer than she remembered, streaked with gray at the temples, and his face was lined with age. But his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, were unmistakable. Ethan, she whispered, her voice breaking. He stared at her, his expression unreadable. Claire. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them felt heavier than the years they'd been apart. Claire's feet felt rooted to the ground, but her heart urged her forward. She took a hesitant step toward the cabin, her breath hitching in her chest. It's me, she said softly, her voice trembling. It's Claire. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, his eyes scanning her as if trying to reconcile the woman standing before him with the girl he once knew. His arms hung stiffly by his sides, his expression guarded. I didn't think I'd ever see you again. His words stung, though she knew they weren't meant to. Claire fought back the lump in her throat. I didn't know what happened to you. I thought you left us. It wasn't until I found your letters. My letters? Ethan's voice sharpened, and he took a step closer. You have them? You actually read them? Claire nodded, fumbling with her bag. She pulled out a handful of the weathered envelopes, holding them out as if they were proof she had searched for him with her whole heart. Dad kept them locked away. I found them after he died. Ethan's jaw tightened, and he let out a bitter laugh. Of course, he kept them. That's just like him. Controlling everything, even after I was gone. Claire's heart ached at the resentment in his voice. Ethan, I didn't know. I swear, if I'd had any idea. You didn't know because they didn't want you to, he interrupted, his tone sharp but not unkind. They wanted to keep you in their perfect little world, where I didn't exist. I wasn't good enough for them, Claire. Not like you. That's not true, Claire said, her voice rising. You were my brother. You are my brother. I've missed you every single day. Ethan's expression softened for a moment, and he looked away, his gaze drifting toward the trees. It didn't feel that way. Not when they sent me off like I was some problem to be fixed. Claire swallowed the wave of guilt rising in her chest. They were wrong. About you. About everything. And I'm here now because I want to make things right. Ethan's eyes snapped back to hers, and for a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a sigh, he gestured toward the cabin. Come inside. You might as well sit down if we're going to dig up the past. The cabin's interior was simple, but it had a warmth Claire hadn't expected. A small wood stove crackled in the corner, and shelves lined with books and tools took up most of the walls. A faded armchair sat near the window, and the scent of pine lingered in the air. Ethan poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Claire before settling into the armchair. She perched on the edge of a worn couch, clutching the warm mug between her hands. So, he said, leaning back and studying her. What do you want to know? Everything, Claire said without hesitation. Why they sent you away. What happened after. Where you've been all these years. Ethan let out a long breath, rubbing the back of his neck. I'll tell you, but it's not an easy story. I'm ready, Claire said, though her voice wavered. Ethan stared into his coffee for a moment before speaking. It started when I got caught sneaking out one night. I wasn't doing anything bad, just heading to the lake to clear my head. But Dad didn't see it that way. He said I was irresponsible, a bad influence. And when I started pushing back, telling him I didn't want to follow his rules anymore, that's when it all fell apart. Claire frowned. But sending you away? That seems so extreme. Ethan's gaze darkened. It wasn't just that. There was something else. Something bigger. What do you mean? Claire asked, her heart pounding. He hesitated, his fingers tightening around his mug. You remember Vanessa, right? Claire's eyes widened. Vanessa? The girl you used to hang out with? She was a few years older than us. Ethan nodded. We were more than friends. And when Dad found out, he lost it. She wasn't from the kind of family he approved of. He said I was ruining our reputation, that I was throwing away my future for someone who didn't matter. Claire stared at him, stunned. I had no idea. Of course you didn't, Ethan said, his voice bitter. They made sure of that. Dad threatened her family, told them he'd destroy their business if they didn't keep Vanessa away from me. And when that didn't work, they packed me off to St. Margaret's. Claire's hands trembled as she set her mug down. They tore you apart. They tore us apart. How could they? They thought they were protecting you, Ethan said with a shrug, though his voice was tinged with sadness. Keeping you from getting caught up in my so-called mistakes. But you weren't a mistake, Claire said fiercely. They were wrong, Ethan. About everything. He looked at her, a flicker of something. Hope, maybe, crossing his face. It's not that simple, Claire. You can't undo the past. No, she said, leaning forward. But we can start fresh. You don't have to be alone anymore. Ethan's eyes met hers, and for the first time, the walls he'd built around himself seemed to crack. Maybe, he said quietly, maybe it's time. The conversation stretched into the evening, both siblings sharing stories, piecing together fragments of the life they'd lost. As Claire left the cabin that night, she felt a flicker of hope. The road to healing wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, she felt like she had her brother back. But as she drove away, a question lingered in her mind. If their parents had hidden this secret, what else had they buried? The next morning, Claire awoke in her childhood bedroom, sunlight streaming through the thin curtains. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying every word Ethan had said. Despite the warmth of their reunion, there was still so much unresolved. Ethan's story about Vanessa haunted her. If their parents had gone so far as to threaten her family, what else had they been capable of? The idea that her father, so composed and traditional, had wielded his influence like a weapon unsettled her. She needed answers. As she sat up, her eyes landed on the box of letters she had brought back from the study. A part of her hesitated to dig deeper. It felt like unearthing a grave, but she knew she had no choice. Ethan deserved the full truth, and so did she. An hour later, Claire was back in her father's study, her fingers trailing over the worn spines of the books that lined the shelves. Her gaze settled on a leather-bound journal tucked away in the corner, its edges worn from years of handling. She pulled it free, her heart pounding. Inside, the handwriting was unmistakably her father's. The entries were meticulous, detailing everything from work meetings to weather observations. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a boring record of his life. But then she found an entry dated just a week before Ethan was sent away. Ethan's behavior is spiraling out of control. Vanessa's influence has poisoned him. She comes from nothing, and she'll drag him down with her if I allow it. I've spoken to her parents, warned them about what will happen if they don't put a stop to this nonsense. But Ethan is stubborn. He refuses to listen, refuses to see reason. I've made arrangements with St. Margaret's. It's the only way to protect him and the family. Claire will never understand, but it's for the best. Someday, she'll thank me. Claire's stomach churned as she read the words. Protect him? No, this wasn't about protecting Ethan. It was about control. Her father had orchestrated everything, not to save Ethan, but to maintain his carefully curated image of their family. He hadn't cared about the cost. She flipped to the next entry. Vanessa came by the house today, begging to see Ethan. I told her it was over. She cried, said she'd never tell anyone, but I can't take that risk. I've sent her away. She'll stay quiet if she knows what's good for her. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Sent her away? What did that mean? She slammed the journal shut, her hands trembling. Vanessa hadn't just disappeared from Ethan's life. Her father had made sure of it. She needed to talk to Ethan. Now, Ethan was waiting for her when she arrived at the cabin, as if he'd expected her to come back. His expression was wary, but there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there the day before. I found Dad's journal, Claire said, skipping any preamble. I know what he did to you. And to Vanessa. Ethan's jaw clenched, his body tensing. What did it say? Claire hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. He threatened her family, and then he sent her away. He made sure you'd never see her again. Ethan let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. Of course he did. That's exactly the kind of man he was. Always pulling strings, always deciding what was best for everyone else. Do you know where she went? Claire asked gently. No, Ethan said, his voice tight. I tried to find her after I left St. Margaret's, but she was gone. Her family moved, too. It was like she disappeared off the face of the earth. Claire felt a surge of determination. Then we'll find her. Ethan frowned. Claire, it's been 20 years. You think she's just been waiting for me this whole time? It's not about that, Claire said. It's about giving you closure. Don't you want to know what happened to her? He didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Finally, he nodded. Yeah, I do. Their search began with old records. Claire combed through public databases, looking for any trace of Vanessa or her family. It was slow, frustrating work, but she refused to give up. Ethan joined her occasionally, though she could tell the process was painful for him. Weeks passed before they found their first real lead. An old newspaper clipping about a local art exhibition. One of the featured artists was listed as Vanessa Reed, a name that matched Vanessa's last name. The article was nearly a decade old, but it was something. She's an artist, Claire said, holding up the clipping. She used to paint, didn't she? Ethan stared at the article, a flicker of hope in his eyes. Yeah, she did. The exhibition had taken place in a nearby city, just a few hours' drive from Ashwood. It wasn't much, but it was a start. When they arrived at the gallery, it was clear the exhibition was long gone. The building now housed a co-working space, and the staff had no record of the event. But one of the older employees remembered Vanessa. She was talented, the woman said, had a real eye for color. She sold a few pieces back then, but I haven't seen her in years. Last I heard, she moved to Seattle. Claire's heart sank at the thought of another dead end, but Ethan seemed oddly at peace. It's more than I had before, he said. Thank you. As they walked back to the car, Claire glanced at him. You're okay with this? He nodded. Knowing she's out there, living her life, that's enough for now. I don't need to find her to know she's okay. Claire wasn't sure she believed him, but she let it go. For now. That night, as Claire lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that their father's secrets hadn't all been unearthed. Vanessa's story was just one thread in a tangled web, and something told her there was more to discover. She wasn't sure she was ready for what she might find. Weeks passed, and life began to settle into something resembling normalcy. Claire and Ethan spent more time together, rediscovering the bond they'd lost. It wasn't always easy. Decades of pain and misunderstanding didn't vanish overnight, but there was comfort in the small moments. Sharing coffee on the porch, laughing over childhood memories, and realizing that, for all their differences, they were still family. But as Claire tried to move forward, the unanswered questions about their father gnawed at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that his control over their lives ran deeper than they had uncovered. Determined to confront the past once and for all, Claire returned to the study one final time. Tucked away in the back of a drawer, she found a sealed envelope with her name on it. The handwriting was shaky, as though her father had written it in his final days. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Claire, if you're reading this, then I am gone, and you've likely uncovered things I worked hard to bury. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I hope you'll understand. Everything I did was for the good of our family, or so I believed at the time. Ethan, I was too hard on him. He was always so full of fire, so determined to live life on his own terms. I thought I was protecting him, but I see now that I only drove him away. I robbed him of his freedom, and I robbed you of a brother. There's something I need you to know. Vanessa didn't just disappear. She came to me before she left, desperate to see Ethan one last time. I refused, of course, but what I didn't tell her, what I couldn't bear to tell anyone, was that she was pregnant. I offered her money, told her it was best for everyone if she left quietly. She took it and swore she'd never contact Ethan again. I believed I was doing the right thing, but as the years went on, I couldn't escape the guilt. I've often wondered what became of her, and of the child. If you choose to pursue this, I hope it brings you both the closure I never found. You and Ethan deserve the truth, even if it casts me in an unflattering light. I am sorry, Claire, for everything. Dad, ***. The letter slipped from Claire's fingers, landing softly on the desk. She sat in stunned silence, her father's words echoing in her mind. Vanessa had been pregnant. Ethan had a child who would now be an adult, somewhere out in the world. The next morning, Claire drove to Ethan's cabin. He was outside, splitting firewood, and looked up when she pulled in. One look at her face, and his brow furrowed in concern. "What's wrong?" he asked, setting the axe aside. Claire held out the letter. "You need to read this." Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans and took the envelope, his expression unreadable as he scanned the contents. When he finished, he sank onto the porch steps, his hands shaking. "She was pregnant," he murmured. "All this time, I thought I lost her, but I lost them both." Claire sat beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We can find them, Ethan. It's not too late." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "And if they don't want to be found? Then we respect that," Claire said gently. "But you deserve to know. And so do they." With the details from the letter, Claire and Ethan began their search. This time, it didn't take long. A private investigator traced Vanessa to a small town in Oregon, where she ran a community art center. Ethan was hesitant to reach out, afraid of reopening old wounds, but Claire encouraged him to take the chance. Vanessa's response came in the form of a phone call. When Ethan answered, his voice cracked as he said her name. Claire sat nearby, tears streaming down her face as she listened to her brother stumble through an apology, trying to explain decades of silence in just a few words. Vanessa's voice was calm, but there was emotion beneath it. "I never blamed you, Ethan. I was angry at your father, at the situation, but not at you. I always hoped you'd find me someday. A week later, they met at the art center. Vanessa looked older, but the warmth in her smile was the same. She hugged Ethan tightly, whispering something in his ear that made him nod and wipe his eyes. Then she introduced them to her daughter, Lila. Lila was 19, a college student with her mother's artistic talent and Ethan's sharp wit. She looked at Ethan with cautious curiosity, and Claire could see the flicker of recognition in her brother's face. This was his daughter, the connection he hadn't even known he was missing. Over the following months, the fragile threads of their new family began to weave together. Vanessa and Ethan spent hours talking, reminiscing, and rebuilding trust. Lila warmed to Ethan slowly, but surely, and even began visiting his cabin to paint the surrounding landscapes. Claire found herself marveling at the way things had changed, how something so broken could begin to heal. One evening, as the sun set over the mountains, Ethan and Claire sat on the porch, watching Lila and Vanessa laugh together by the creek. I spent so many years angry at Dad, Ethan said quietly. But if he hadn't written that letter, if you hadn't found it, Claire smiled softly, we wouldn't be here. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on Lila. I can't change the past, but I can do better now. For her. For all of us. And in that moment, Claire knew they had found what they were searching for. Not just Ethan's family, but their own sense of peace.